Hello again, everybody. Next up, we have the privilege of introducing Dr. Rob Scott. Dr. Scott is a Zimbabwean-born physician and a graduate of the University of Cape Town. He has held leadership positions for over 30 years in the world's leading biopharma companies, including J&J, Pfizer, Amgen, and AbbVie. During that time, he has led development teams responsible for highly successful brands such as Norvasc, Lipitor, Repatha, Humira, Skyrizi, and Rinvoq. Prior to his recent retirement as Chief Medical Officer and Head of Development at AbbVie, Dr. Scott was responsible for a team of over 4,000 individuals across 52 countries, a budget of close to $3 billion, and programs involving 40 new molecular entities. During his tenure, AbbVie achieved over 14 major regulatory approvals. Dr. Scott was a member of the FDA Cardiorenal and the Endocrine and Metabolic Drug Advisory Committees from 2012 to 2016. He also created the Development Design Center, a center of excellence focused on using predictive analytics and big data to design and implement clinical trials. He has been a board member of Transcelerate and a member of the Pharma R&D Leadership Forum. Dr. Scott is considered an industry leader in the use of predictive analytics and big data to design and implement clinical trials and in digital transformation of clinical research. We're honored to have him here today, and I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Scott. Thanks.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for coming here to listen to me talk about one of my pet passions, and also thanks to Aris Global for this opportunity. I'm going to talk to you about drug development in the 21st century and why it's time that we need to make some very critical changes. It's pretty clear that with the growth of technology, that the rate of doubling of knowledge has sped up incredibly in recent years. It's always been exponential, but now we're on a part of the curve where knowledge is doubling every 11 to 12 hours, according to a study done by IBM. In medicine, knowledge is estimated to be doubling every 18 months. So with all of this new knowledge available, there must be better ways to treat disease and manage healthcare than the ways we've followed for the last 100 years. And there must also be better ways to understand biology and pathobiology and use those understandings to drive drug development. The current drug process has really not changed over the last 50 years. It's long, it's expensive, it's failure prone. It takes 10 to 15 years from the development of a new target to the appearance of a medication in the marketplace, and the cost of developing a new drug is around $2.6 billion. Obviously, these are things that hold back drug development. In the face of all of that, R&D productivity has remained largely unchanged since 1996. It had been on a long-term decline, and in recent years we've seen some improvements in the rate of R&D productivity, but really since 1996, there really hasn't been any change, despite a massive amount of investment in new tools. There are some really large challenges in clinical trial research. First of all, as I mentioned before, there's the high cost of drug development, $2.6 billion per new successful drug on the marketplace. Patient access to the process of drug development is a huge problem. In a study done by Tufts, they found that 70% of patients would like the opportunity to participate in drug trials. However, in reality, only about 2% of patients do actually participate. And the biggest problem for that is patients live too far away from sites to actually participate. Now, with the competition for patients in new drug programs and trials, this issue with only 2% of patients being able to participate is one of the fundamental reasons why it takes so long to go through the clinical process, because the time for recruitment is one of the biggest factors in how long it takes to complete a trial. As I mentioned before, the time from the lab to the medicine closet of 10 to 15 years is a big problem. And we still have problems with trial adherence and compliance. So patients drop out of clinical trials. On average, even compliant patients take their medication about 80% of the time. So we don't get to see the results, the best possible results for the therapies that we're testing. And when we look at the the results of the drug, the impact that it has on the parameter that you're looking for, typically we will measure this every 2 weeks, every 4 weeks, every 8 weeks, sometimes every month. And if you think about it, you're running a study where you're looking at blood pressure and you're measuring the blood pressure every 4 weeks, and the patient has a bad day on the day that they come to the clinic, you're getting a data point that's really just not reflective of what the patient's doing in relationship to the medication. Now, if we had real-time monitoring with patients' blood pressure being measured at home on a daily or twice daily basis, we would be able to overcome those variabilities due to changes in the patient's environment. So we really need a lot more real-time monitoring for drug efficacy. So drug development is at a crossroads. In a recent meeting I had with the FDA, Bob Temple agreed with me that drug development is a disaster in cardiovascular diseases, for instance. If we look at cardiovascular disease, it's a highly prevalent chronic disease. About 50% of people will develop hypertension in their lifetime. It used to be one of the largest areas for drug investment, investment by VCs and pharmaceutical companies. And that's entirely appropriate because cardiovascular disease still remains the leading cause of premature death. However, in recent years, because these are prevalent diseases and you can't charge orphan prices, investment has fled the cardiovascular market. So it's gone from being the largest area of investment to the smallest area of investment. And clearly that's just not productive for improving human health. The focus has switched to areas where very high prices can be charged. And so these tend to be areas where the patient population isn't large and the budget impact of paying for high-priced drugs is not so high for payers. And so pharma companies have tended to focus now on oncology and orphan disease. But this is not going to be sustainable in the long term. In 10 or 20 years, we'll have a treatment for every kind of oncological disease and every orphan disease. And so although the individual diseases may be quite rare, taken across the entire categories, it's going to be pretty common, and payers will increasingly start to focus on the affordability of the total pot of these conditions. Now, the good news is that there are very powerful temporal forces that are going to reverse some of these trends. We've seen the appearance of unlimited compute and storage capacity and the increasing prevalence of the Internet of Things being available in different categories of devices. And so digitalization is going to bring enormous efficiencies to traditional clinical trials. And I'll talk a little bit about that later on, how that is happening. In addition to that, alternative models of clinical research, such as virtual clinical trials or virtualized clinical trials, real-world trials, are going to reduce costs. And the increasing ability to use real-world data and real-world evidence for all phases of research is going to be a major impact. At the moment, there's no way to use real-world data to support first approval of a drug because patients are not using that drug in the real-world setting before approval. But even that will change. So let's take a futuristic look forward as to what the healthcare environment is going to look like 10 years on. So in terms of the macro environment, globally, people will be living longer, and this means that the number of elderly people will have grown by 56% to 1.4 billion by the year 2030. And this increasing aging of the population is going to bring major challenges from companies to meet the resource demands that will come with that. U.S. healthcare expenditures will have risen in 2030 from 16% to 26%, and a government will have become the dominant payer over the private payer. In fact, we're sitting right on that cusp at the moment. Healthcare policy will have evolved, and technology will be routinely utilized to offset the unrelenting pressures of this aging population. Data will be much more transparent, and patients will be taking much greater control of their health and their personal data. And big tech will have become a major player in healthcare. And you can see on the slide a number of the categories, and they are already advancing in those fields. Healthcare will have changed. Payers will be routinely reimbursing digitally enabled interventions and care. Healthcare organizations will have evolved into high-tech centers. Aftercare will be managed through smart home devices, wearables, the Internet of Things, so that physicians can track their patients at home. And increasingly, patients will be managed at home. I talked about patients and their healthcare records. We're already seeing the rise of machine learning and predictive analytics to try and inform diagnosis and treatments. It's still in the early days, but it's obviously going to develop at a rapid pace. And we talked about patients being more connected through the Internet of Things. The pharmaceutical industry will have changed. On the positive side, global spending on pharmaceuticals is driven by the demographic shifts, will have grown by 160%. The biggest increases will be in India and China, but the US will continue to grow as well. We talked about the government as the dominant payer. The efficacy of treatment will now be much more obvious because we'll have supplemental sources of information to track how patients are doing. Pharmaceuticals will need to demonstrate value within the broader healthcare ecosystem. And a lot of that expectation will come around leveraging technology. He said before, big tech, established player, and precision medicine, which is already becoming very common in oncology, is going to become more common in other disease states as therapies need to be more targeted towards patients that are going to respond. Clinical development will have changed too. There will be more bringing solutions to market that have inclusive of around-the-pill digital offerings. So the ability of the patient to manage their therapy, for the physician to adjust and titrate dosage and to see how the patient is responding will become the norm. Drug development will have become much less of a phase-by-phase process with a lot of manual operations to a continuous process with a lot of the trial data collected passively, either through the electronic medical record or through IoT. AI will be the norm in terms of identifying better drug candidates. Precision medicine, as I said before, to identify the right patient, the right drug, the right dose, and the right time. And patients will be more routinely included in clinical program development and clinical trial design through crowdsourcing and patient advisory boards. And they're going to demand that. And there will be strong partnerships through tech and pharma, and some of the time that's going to be acquisitions of pharma by big tech companies. Now, there are several things holding us back at the moment. The one is some very standard thinking in the industry around, for instance, what's required to get a drug approved. If you talk to 10 physicians in the industry, at least 9 of them will tell you that in order to get a drug approved, you need 2 pivotal studies that report out to the p-value of less than 0.05. And this is their interpretation of the FDA regulations. But in fact, the FDA has never said that you need 2 pivotal studies. The FDA has always talked about substantial evidence. And they say, such as maybe 2 pivotal studies. But the FDA is quite open to alternative ways of proving the efficacy of a drug, so long as the evidence is substantial and believable. So the industry will need to move away from these long-held beliefs that are not based on fact. The need for this has been recognized by regulators and by legislators. And so we see the 21st Century Cures Act leading towards the ability to use more real-world evidence in drug approval. The 21st Century Care Act includes a number of the things that I've been talking about, such as the voice of the patient, using more real-world evidence, using more innovative clinical trial designs, and accelerating the qualification and use of biomarkers, including digital biomarkers, which is going to be a big thing. The FDA is running their own studies to try and work out what are the issues to be able to believe real-world evidence. RCT duplicate is an FDA project to try and duplicate the major randomized controlled trials using real-world evidence. They also have the REPEAT project looking at duplicating clinical trials out of electronic medical records and large healthcare databases. So clearly they're making the investment in this. Real-world data is going to accelerate and is already accelerating clinical development in a number of ways. And I'm not going to go through this slide. I'm just going to talk a little bit while you have the opportunity to maybe just scan some of the topics there. But real-world evidence is going to revolutionize all aspects of clinical trials and at the same time will replace a lot of clinical trials. Digital health is actually transforming every stage of clinical trials. So firstly, we have social media and web platforms are being used to get patient insights on clinical trials, adverse events, and drug efficacy, getting information about trial efficacy, trial feasibility, and also predominant use is to find patients and enroll them into clinical trials. Predictive analytics to produce better protocols, conduct better study feasibility, find patients, and also improve study surveillance and risk-based monitoring. The use of mobile applications for patients to find clinical trials and to facilitate all of the process of being in a clinical trial, both for patients and for physicians. So many companies now are working on a digital ecosystem that will make a very fluid trial participation process for physicians, patients, and people in the pharma industry working on it. The use of wearables and sensors, Internet of Things is going to change things a lot and facilitate smaller studies with more robust endpoints. Internally, sponsors, electronic systems are changing rapidly. There's lots of development in making the whole process of clinical development a much more digitally enabled process. And then finally, telemedicine is going to enable patients to participate in clinical trials from wherever they are. They won't need to be near a clinical trial site. The 68% of patients that would like to participate in clinical trials will be able to participate because the patient will be able to interact with the physician through telemedicine, the investigator through telemedicine, and then sponsors will use home healthcare workers to visit patients and do the things that can't be done through telemedicine. One of the issues with this is the rapid profusion of a massive number of technology players. And all of this is good. It's all driving a lot of innovation. But as a sponsor, you need to be aware that many of these technology players will not be in existence next year, 5 years from now. So you need to be very thoughtful about who you adopt in order to help you with this process. So I hope what I've been able to establish for you is that to disrupt drug development with digital health, or just disrupt drug development in the way that we need to abandon that concept of we've always done it like this, it's always worked, why fix something if it ain't broke? We need to abandon tried and true. And Henry Ford once said, if I just asked people what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. You've got to think outside of the box. Abraham Lincoln said, the best way to predict the future is to create it. So as a sponsor, as you're thinking about the future, try and be involved in creating the new future that you would like to predict. The saying once said attributed to George W. Bush was, you can't do today's job with yesterday's methods and be in business tomorrow. And that seems kind of obvious. Now, what you need to bear in mind is that many of the players in the pharma world are already deep in the process of innovation. And as you're thinking about today's methods, just bear in mind that you'll find out 5 years from now that they've already moved on. It takes that much time for that information to get out there. So you can't even be using today's methods to be successful tomorrow. So my saying is, we should aspire to do today's job with tomorrow's methods to meet the challenges of the future. So lastly, my last challenge to you is think differently and think big. Remember that this is all about the patients, getting new therapies to patients who critically need them to promote world health. Thank you very much for your attention.